It was a cold, moonless night when Sarah decided to take a shortcut through the old, abandoned road that cut through the dense forest. She had been visiting her friend in the neighboring town and lost track of time, realizing too late that she would have to drive back home in the dead of night. As she turned onto the narrow, winding road, her headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness that seemed to engulf her car. The trees on either side of the road loomed over her, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers as it tried to grab her vehicle. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed the eerie silence that surrounded her. There were no sounds of nocturnal animals, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, her car began to sputter and cough, the engine struggling to keep running. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that she was running out of gas. She had been so focused on getting home that she had forgotten to fill up her tank before leaving her friend's house. As the car finally sputtered to a stop, Sarah found herself stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the darkness and the trees for company. She reached for her phone, hoping to call for help, but to her horror, she discovered that there was no signal. Panic began to set in as Sarah realized the gravity of her situation. She was alone in the middle of the forest, with no way to contact anyone. She knew that her only option was to walk back to the main road and hope that someone would pass by and offer her assistance. As she stepped out of her car, the cold night air hit her like a slap in the face. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve warmth, and began to walk down the road, her footsteps echoing in the silence. But as she walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She could feel eyes on her, hidden in the shadows of the trees, tracking her every move. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest, as she tried to outrun the unseen threat. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her, matching her pace. Sarah spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there, just the empty road and the dark forest. She turned back around and continued walking, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer with each passing second. Sarah broke into a run, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. She could hear the footsteps behind her, gaining on her, getting closer and closer. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure emerge from the trees, a dark silhouette against the night sky. She screamed, her voice echoing through the forest, as the figure lunged towards her, and then everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she found herself lying on the side of the road, her car parked a few feet away. She sat up, her head pounding, as she tried to remember what had happened. But all she could recall was the terror she had felt, the footsteps behind her, and the dark figure that had emerged from the trees. As she stumbled back to her car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting for her in the shadows. And as she drove away, the old, abandoned road disappearing in her rearview mirror, she knew that she would never forget the horror of that midnight ride. Sarah finally reached the main road, her heart still racing from the terrifying experience she had just endured. She flagged down a passing car and explained her situation to the concerned driver, who graciously offered to take her to the nearest gas station. As they drove away from the old, abandoned road, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the dark forest, half expecting to see the shadowy figure emerge from the trees once more. But there was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the night. At the gas station, Sarah filled up her car and thanked the kind stranger who had helped her. She knew that she should go straight home, but something inside her couldn't let go of what had happened on that lonely road. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself driving back towards the forest, determined to find out what had really happened to her. She parked her car at the edge of the road and stepped out, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she walked deeper into the forest, Sarah felt a sense of unease wash over her. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out to grab her. And then she heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind her. Sarah spun around, her flashlight illuminating the area behind her. And there, standing just a few feet away, was the dark figure she had seen earlier. But as she shone her light on its face, Sarah felt her blood run cold. It was her own face staring back at her, twisted into a grotesque smile. Sarah screamed, dropping her flashlight as she stumbled backwards, and then the figure lunged at her, its hands closing around her throat. Sarah woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest. She was lying in her own bed, safe and sound. It had all been a dream, a terrible nightmare brought on by the stress of her midnight ride. But as she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. And as she drifted off to sleep once more, She knew that the horror of that night would haunt her forever. Years later, Sarah found herself driving down that same old, abandoned road once more. She had never been able to forget what had happened to her that night, and something inside her had always drawn her back to that place. As she turned onto the narrow, winding road, Sarah felt a sense of déjà vu wash over her. The trees looked the same, the silence just as eerie as it had been all those years ago. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, its form silhouetted against the headlights of her car. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked closer, Sarah realized that the figure was not a person at all, but a deer, its eyes glowing in the darkness. She breathed a sigh of relief, watching as the animal bounded off into the forest. And as she sat there, her car idling on that lonely road, Sarah realized that the true horror of that night had not been the shadowy figure or the footsteps behind her, but the fear that had consumed her, the terror that had taken hold of her mind and refused to let go. She knew then that she had to let go of that fear, to move on from the nightmare that had haunted her for so long. And as she drove away from that old, abandoned road for the last time, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her, knowing that she had finally faced her demons and emerged stronger on the other side. Kevin had always been a cautious driver, especially when it came to long trips at night. However, his job as a traveling salesman often required him to navigate through unfamiliar roads and highways, no matter the time of day. One particularly dark and moonless night, Kevin found himself driving along a desolate stretch of highway, with nothing but his headlights to guide him through the inky blackness. As he cruised along the empty road, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the steady hum of his car's engine. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, noting that it was well past midnight. Suddenly, in his rearview mirror, Kevin noticed a pair of headlights rapidly approaching from behind. At first, he thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another late-night traveler. But as the vehicle drew closer, Kevin realized that it was driving erratically, swerving from one side of the road to the other. A sense of unease crept over him as he watched the car close the distance between them at an alarming rate. Kevin's heart began to race as the car pulled up alongside him. The driver's window rolled down. In the dim light of the dashboard, Kevin could make out the face of a man, his features twisted into a maniacal grin. The man's eyes locked with Kevin's, and he let out a chilling laugh that sent shivers down Kevin's spine. Panicking, Kevin slammed his foot on the accelerator, desperate to put some distance between himself and the deranged driver. But no matter how fast he drove, the other car kept pace, the man's laughter echoing through the night air. Kevin's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to escape. He knew that he couldn't keep driving forever, and the next town was still miles away. Suddenly, he remembered a small gas station he had passed a few miles back. If he could just make it there, he might be able to find help or at least a place to hide. With renewed determination, Kevin took a sharp turn off the highway, his tires screeching against the pavement. The other car followed close behind, the man's laughter growing louder and more unhinged with each passing second. As Kevin sped down the narrow road, he could see the faint glow of the gas station's lights in the distance. He pushed his car to its limits, the engine whining in protest as he urged it forward. Just as he was about to reach the safety of the gas station, the other car suddenly swerved in front of him, cutting him off and forcing him to slam on the brakes. Kevin's car skidded to a halt, mere inches from the bumper of the other vehicle. The man stepped out, a wicked grin on his face as he approached Kevin's window. Kevin's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for his phone, desperate to call for help. But before he could dial, the man reached through the window, his hand closing around Kevin's throat. Kevin struggled against the man's grip, gasping for air as he tried to break free. The man's laughter filled his ears, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Just as Kevin felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. The man's grip loosened, and Kevin looked up to see a police car speeding towards them, its lights flashing. The man cursed under his breath and released Kevin, darting back to his own car and speeding off into the darkness. Kevin sat there, his heart racing as he watched the police car chase after the man. He knew that he had been incredibly lucky to escape with his life. As he waited for the officers to return, Kevin couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't remembered the gas station, or if the police hadn't arrived when they did. From that night on, Kevin never took his safety for granted again. He always made sure to plan his routes carefully and avoided driving at night whenever possible. And whenever he found himself on a lonely stretch of highway, he couldn't help but glance in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see those haunting headlights and hear that chilling laughter once more. As the years passed, Kevin tried to put the horrifying experience behind him. He changed jobs, settling for a position that didn't require him to travel at night. However, the memory of that maniacal grin and the haunting laughter never left him. He often woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest as he relived the terrifying encounter in his dreams. One evening, while watching the news, Kevin's blood ran cold. The reporter was covering a story about a serial killer who had been terrorizing the very same highway where Kevin had his brush with death. The police had finally managed to apprehend the killer, and as they showed his photograph on the screen, Kevin felt his stomach drop. It was the same man who had attacked him that night, the same twisted grin etched on his face. Desperate for closure, Kevin reached out to the authorities, sharing his story with them. The police informed him that he had been one of the lucky few to escape the killer's clutches. The man, they revealed, had been preying on unsuspecting travelers for years, using the cover of darkness to stalk and attack his victims. Knowing that the killer was finally behind bars brought Kevin a sense of relief, but it also dredged up old fears and memories that he had tried so hard to suppress. He knew that he needed to confront his demons once and for all. Kevin made the decision to drive down that haunting highway one last time. As he set out on the road, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms sweaty against the steering wheel. The memories of that night flooded back to him, and he could almost hear the killer's laughter echoing in his ears. But as he drove, Kevin realized that something had changed. The once desolate highway now seemed less menacing, the darkness less oppressive. He knew that the killer was no longer a threat, and that knowledge gave him strength. As he approached the spot where the attack had taken place, Kevin pulled over to the side of the road. He stepped out of his car, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. He looked up at the stars, marveling at their beauty and the sense of peace that washed over him. At that moment, Kevin realized that he had finally broken free from the chains of his past. The killer no longer had any power over him, and he could finally move on with his life. He knew that he would never forget what had happened to him, but he also knew that he was stronger because of it. With a sense of closure and a newfound appreciation for life, Kevin got back in his car and drove off into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had survived the haunting highway, and he knew that he could survive anything else that life threw his way. Kevin sat by the campfire, listening to the adults tell his story to the children. It became a local story that was passed from mouth to mouth to scare the kids and warn them against the dangers of night trips. They say that Kevin was driving along a deserted road that night, illuminated only by the headlights of his old car. One of the men began. Suddenly, he noticed in the rearview mirror a strange silhouette in the back seat. It was the same maniac who had been chasing him for miles. The children held their breath, afraid to move. Kevin froze too, lost in the memories of that terrible incident. The maniac began to slowly approach Kevin, holding a sharp knife in his hand. The narrator continued. Kevin felt cold sweat trickling down his back. He knew that he had to act quickly, otherwise he would become another victim of a madman. Kevin shuddered, as if he had actually felt that chilling horror. He still couldn't forget how desperately he was stepping on the gas, trying to break away from his pursuer. The road twisted and the car skidded on turns, but Kevin did not slow down. At some point, the maniac almost reached for Kevin's throat, but then a deep ditch appeared in the way. The man by the campfire said. Kevin turned the steering wheel sharply and the car overturned. He miraculously survived the accident, but no one else saw the maniac. They say that since then, the ghost of a madman has been wandering along this road in search of new victims. The children gasped, clinging to each other. Kevin sighed heavily, glad that everything was in the past. However, he knew that he would never be able to forget that terrible night and his miraculous escape. Now his story has become a local legend, warning others against the dangers that may await in the dark.